There was a man named Jerome, known in his small town for two things: his heavy drinking and his fiery temper. In his youth, Jerome wasn't much different from the other men in town, a bit rough around the edges, but hard-working. But somewhere along the line, the booze took hold, and Jerome became a fixture at O'Hara's pub. Each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jerome would take his seat at the bar, already drunk from the bottle hidden in his coat. As the hours passed, so would the drinks, and with every drink, Jerome's mood darkened. Jerome's inner thoughts are punctuated with resentment toward life and the world around him. He stares at the other patrons, happy couples, jovial friends, and feels a surge of anger. Why should they be so happy, he thinks, finishing his beer.
You looking at me funny?
Jerome said, swaying on his feet, slurs his words as he sizes up a man 2 seats down. The bar patrons, all too familiar with Jerome's outbursts, shift in their seats, avoiding eye contact. The bartender, fed up, polishes a glass and shakes his head. The locals were used to it by now, but they were tired of his antics, yet no one dared confront him. His size and temper had won too many bar fights for anyone to try, but deep down, everyone knew. Jerome's rage wasn't really at them, it was at himself. One night, as the full moon hung heavy in the sky, a stranger strolled into town. His arrival didn't raise much alarm at first. Small towns are used to travelers passing through. But this one was different. He was quiet, calm, and impeccably dressed in a long black coat that seemed to flow as he walked. He carried himself with an air of authority that was hard to ignore. At O'Hara's pub, the door creaked open and the stranger stepped in. Conversations paused, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the wooden floor under the stranger's boots. The townsfolk whispered about him as he took a seat at the far end of the bar. Who was he? What business did he have here? But Jerome didn't care about those questions. To him, the stranger was a new target. Jerome narrowed his eyes, already feeling the familiar heat of drunken aggression bubbling inside him.
Hey you,
Jerome said, as he slurred, staggering slightly as he turned to face the stranger.
what you doing here, huh?
The stranger, calm as ever, looked up and gave a polite smile.
I'm just passing through.
Jerome wasn't satisfied with the stranger's answer. In his foggy, alcohol-clouded mind, the man's politeness was an insult. Who did this stranger think he was? Jerome stood up, knocking over his bar stool as he advanced toward the man. The stranger stood as well, but rather than retaliating, he simply walked toward the door. Jerome followed him outside, the cool night air doing nothing to sober him up.
You think you're too good for me?
Jerome shouted, his words thick with anger and liquor. The stranger kept walking, not looking back. His silence only enraged Jerome more. As the stranger reached the curb, Jerome lunged forward, his drunken fist connecting with the side of the stranger's face. The blow sent a shockwave of tension through the quiet street. The stranger straightened up, rubbing his eye where Jerome's fist had landed. He sighed, a deep, tired sigh, as if he had seen this all before. The stranger's face darkened, and a coldness settled into his voice.
I tried to spare you, but now you learn the hard way.
The wind seemed to shift around them, carrying a low, unnatural hum. The streetlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pavement as the stranger raised his hand.
From this day forward, you'll be drunk, even when sober. And no matter how hard you try, you'll never find your way home. Your house will always be within sight, but never within reach.
Green mist swirled around the stranger's hand, and strange symbols glowed in the air. Jerome stood dumbfounded, unable to comprehend what was happening. But deep inside, a chill ran down his spine. The next morning, Jerome woke up on a park bench, head pounding like it always did, after a night of heavy drinking, but something felt different. Jerome groaned, sitting up and holding his head. He squinted at the bright morning sun and tried to recall how he had ended up outside. No big deal, Jerome muttered, convinced he had just had another wild night. But as he stood to walk home, his legs wobbled beneath him and the world spun around him. Yet he hadn't had a drop to drink since the night before. His stomach lurched, his vision blurred, It felt like he'd had a dozen drinks, even though he hadn't touched any alcohol that morning. Panic set in.
Something's wrong. Real wrong.
As Jerome stumbled through the streets, he saw his house in the distance. Relief flooded through him. He just needed to get home and everything would be fine. But as Jerome walked, something strange happened. No matter how many steps he took, the house seemed to slide further and further away. He stopped, shook his head, and tried again. The same thing happened. His house was always just out of reach. Over and over he tried different paths, shortcuts, even running, but it was no use. His house loomed in the distance, glowing warmly, but Jerome could never reach it. Days turned into weeks, and the curse only worsened. Jerome stopped drinking entirely, but it didn't matter. His body felt perpetually drunk, stumbling and swaying, as if he'd been drinking all day. People on the street began to avoid him, whispering that he was even worse than before. As Jerome wandered the town in a drunken haze, he heard the whispers, saw the pitying glances. But inside, Jerome was desperate. He hadn't had a drink in days, yet the world continued to spin, and the ground seemed to shift beneath him. Jerome tried everything, taking buses, riding a bike, even asking strangers for help, but nothing worked. The curse was relentless. No matter what he did, his house remained out of reach. He became a fixture in the town, always seen walking aimlessly, muttering under his breath, a lost soul trapped in a nightmare of his own making. One night, Jerome found himself sitting on a bench, staring at his house in the distance. The warm light in the windows mocked him, always so close, yet forever out of reach. For the first time, Jerome's anger faded, replaced by something else, regret. He thought about all the fights he'd started, the people he'd hurt, and the bridges he'd burned. He realized in that moment that the curse wasn't just magic. It was punishment for a lifetime of recklessness.
How did I end up like this?
As the months passed, the town moved on. Life returned to normal, and Jerome became little more than a legend, a cautionary tale whispered among the townsfolk. People would say, if you ever meet a stranger, treat them with respect. You never know if they're a warlock with a curse up their sleeve. Some say Jerome is still out there, forever wandering, forever drunk, even when sober. And if you ever see him, be kind. A little kindness might have changed his fate. But now, it's too late for that. Jerome's figure disappears into the dark woods, his house shimmering far away, a reminder of what he's lost forever. And that's the story of Jerome, the man cursed to always be drunk and never go home. If you enjoyed this tale, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And remember, be careful who you cross.